saw a snake or a chipmunk, or maybe
yeah, I'll just stay back here. I'm good.
some kind, maybe a mouse. It might have been a field mouse.
Okay. All right, you just have your fun.
Well, I need that light.
Yeah.
All right, fine. I'll come get it. It's hot out here. Hot and humid. But that's not stopping me. That's not stopping us from bringing you the news from out here. May not be news, it's pretty old news by now. We've seen a lot of stuff on the web about this stuff, but still wanted to see it with my own eyes. This one's kind of hidden back here. The watermelons.
You close the door. I can't see anything here. Kim, you there? What happened? What is that?
Yeah, it is. So we can move along here.
No, this can't be. It's a lost episode of Pretzels History.
Work, but their time of the day was at noon, and there's actually bells that still ring today at 11:30, and that was to signal everybody to stop what they were doing at work or at school and to come back home for the noon meal. So the Moravians actually would have church 3 times a day. They would have prayer before breakfast. They would have a church service after the noon meal, and then they would have vespers in the evening. So everything was very close by. You know, anybody who was working in their shop could come home and gather in the middle of the day. This on top of the table, any guesses what that is?
I would have no clue.
Okay, it is.
Would you?
It's a fly chaser, and so it's spring wound. They could wind it up, and then it would just slowly circle around and keep the flies from landing on your food. They were really ingenious. They came up with a lot of things. You can see the doors that are across from each other. That's intentional, so you get some nice cross ventilation going, but it also then allows the bugs in. The chairs were made in the brother's house. Again, here's one of these tapes or straps that they would weave, and that was a job that children had. Other jobs that children had in this corner, again, you know, keeping them from being idle and getting into, you know, the devil's pastimes. Yeah. They would have them churn butter. They would have them go out to the barn or the chickens and collect eggs. Any guesses on this contraption?
No. I was going to say like a saw or something.
Yeah, I think in my years of giving tours, I think one guy has gotten it right. It's a sausage stuffer. So you put your ground meat in here and work this handle up and down, and it forces the meat through, and then the child could hold the casing and make the sausage links.
Okay.
Another job for kids, this is a flour safe. So when they would go to the mill and get their flour, you would get a large quantity at a time because you were baking every day. But then it would tend to get some bugs in it. So before the kids went to school in the morning, they would pick the bugs out of whatever flour mom was going to use that day to bake. And this up on top is a cigar stacker. This comes from a little bit later time period. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were actually a lot of cigar factories in Lidditz and Ephrata and Mannheim, like the whole area, because tobacco was being grown on the farms as a cash crop. And so a lot of people were actually employed in cigar factories back then. Any questions down here before we go upstairs?
No, it's just weird though, because I feel like I'm at home, like, because I swear, like, my parents had a huge,
these-
one of those huge things of that, like the one in the back
The
there.
crock, yeah.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
these candle holders, I'm not going to lie,
Yeah.
we actually had them in our walkway when you first walked through the door, so it looks
Yeah.
like I'm like literally walking to my own house with the stuff. Funny.
Okay, well, we can head up the stairs. Please do be careful because they're pretty steep. Take your time and hold the railings. So.
Definitely, because I have a really bad ankle, I'm not going to lie, so he knows I'm like an old lady going up the stairs when I'm actually young. No, why not?
So we will start in the children's room.
Well, that would be my luck.
This is the children's room, and once they graduated from that trundle bed, all the kids in the family would sleep in this room together, boys and girls. The Muellers didn't have a ton of kids, but if you had a large family, they would probably be sharing beds. These are all rope beds in the house, and behind you there is a basket. That is a bassinet that was made for twin girls, and if you look at the front, you can faintly make out their names. It says Ruth and Esther. That's from 1812. But you're standing by our little model here, and that's really just to demonstrate that the kids dress like miniature adults, kind of the way the Amish do today. They dress just like their parents. They help right alongside them. The main difference you'll see is the color of ribbon. So little girls would wear a red ribbon like that, and then when they were about 14 and considered, eligible single ladies, they would get a pink ribbon. Married women would have blue, and widows would wear white. So just by looking at them, everybody in the community knew which group that they were part of. Another thing that's really interesting, I think, about the Moravians is up until 1819, they arranged marriage by the lot. So that means you didn't get to pick who you wanted to marry. If a young man, he had learned a trade, he was ready to get married and support a family, he would go to the church elders and ask them, I want to get married. And they would take the names of 6 of the single sisters with the pink ribbons and write them on slips of paper and put them in a coconut shell. And then whichever one he pulls out, that's considered God's will for who he's supposed to marry and spend the rest of his life with. And then sometimes when I tell that to teenage girls, they're just like, whoa.
What were the ages though that they got married in?
They would typically be a lot older than that. I mean, most people were not getting married. The Mueller children, they actually all got married in the early 1820s, and a lot of them were in their upper 20s, like approaching 30. So, and especially, men would usually be older than the women because they had to learn a trade. But a lot of people wonder about the coconut shell. They're like, where did they get a coconut shell? The Moravians actually had a lot of missionaries and missions into the Caribbean, even back in the 1700s. So I think it's something exotic that they brought back from one of those missionary areas in the Caribbean, and it was a special item that they pulled these names out. But I think, they really believed and trusted that God would provide them with the spouse that they needed to live a life of service to him. So it sounds very strange to us, but they accepted it, and that's what they did.
What about widows? Could they
Widows
get remarried?
they could get remarried, yes, and they did. They did usually get remarried, but they also had the single sisters and the single brothers house, and the Moravians took care of their community. They weren't going to let anybody, go hungry. So they were a very supportive community and made sure everybody was taken care of. On the wall we have, this is a christening dress. This is a little boy's dress because back in the day, boys would wear dresses as well until they were at least past potty training age. And then they would wear like the knee breeches, and then only men would wear pants. And then these are some examples of wooden toys. So if they did have time to play, you have the Jacob's ladder, dolls, a push toy, and these are some wooden bowling balls. We talked before about how they separated the girls and boys school. John Beck Academy had a school for boys from 1815 to 1865, and these were bowling balls from that school. The next thing I'm going to show you, if you can take your camera, I'll show you. You're actually going to want to point it up here through the ceiling, and I'll explain why.
Okay, sure, let's give it a try.
You can see if you can see it.
I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like a little attic. Oh dear, a bee. I mean, I'm not allergic to bees, but there is a bee back there.
Well, I'm just going to leave it. This ladder you could pull down, and it goes up to the attic, and that was made into a smokehouse. Usually you think of a smokehouse as a separate outbuilding in the backyard, but Mr. Mueller, I don't know if he didn't want to go outside in the cold or what, but he was very creative, and he actually plastered the floor of the attic so it would be fireproof, and he had an area to smoke his meat up there. And you can see there are some bricks that you could take out a brick from the chimney to vent the smoke out. And when this was being renovated by the Historical Foundation in the early 1960s, they found this, which is a piece of petrified bacon, and it had been chewed by bats up in the attic, and it was still up there in the smokehouse area.
Oh my word. That's funny.
And these ladies pictured on the wall here, those are some of the last residents of this house. The house was in the Mueller family for just over 100 years, 1792 to 1893, and that was 3 generations. And then it was transferred back to the Moravian Church, and they started using it as a home for elderly ladies, widows, kind of a predecessor to a retirement home today. It was a place where they could live and be taken care of. All right. Well, if you're ready, we can go downstairs and see the workshop.
Sure.
What's that other bedroom back there?
I'm sorry. I totally forgot. Thank you for reminding me. Yes,
No,
that is
okay.
part of the tour. This is the Apprentices Room.
Okay.
And watch your head when you step down here. It's a little low. Thank you for asking.
Oh, you're welcome.
This is the Apprentices Room. And you can see from the wall that we're now above the log portion of the house. So this is directly above the workshop. There would not have been a doorway there. That was cut for us to access it. The apprentices would have used this staircase. And we won't use it because it's very steep. But they could go straight up and down to the workshop, and then they would come up here and sleep at night. So all of the tradesmen would take in a couple apprentice boys who were young teenagers, and they would teach them how to do their trade. And then in exchange, the boys, they had to make sure that they were going to church and to school every day. They would feed them and give them one set of clothing a year in exchange for the work that they did for them. And so Mr. Mueller's apprentices would have slept in this room. And you'll see that it would have been really, really hot in the summer and cold in the winter. They might have had, a coal that they put in that pan to take the chill off, but it would have been very chilly up here. Couple items in this room. If you were not able or didn't want to go out to the outhouse in the middle of the night, you could use a chamber pot. So here's one example of a chamber pot, and then this one is a little more like a seat. And then we have 2 examples of trunks as well. In this corner is a more standard, typical trunk of someone who didn't have a lot of money. They would make it out of whatever wood they could find, and when they came over on the ship from Germany or wherever they were coming from, they would put all of their possessions in there and hope that they made it the trip with them. This one, if you had a little more money, you could get, it's called a gentleman's trunk. And you can see it has a pouch for any documents. It has some fancy artwork. And the most important feature is that the lid is curved on top. And that ensured that when they were loading all of these trunks into the cargo hold of the ship, yours would be on top, and none of your stuff would get smashed or damaged. Okay, we're going to head into the workshop now, and as we walk through here, you can see the width of the stone wall.
Okay.
And now we are in, as you can tell by looking at the walls, the 1740s log structure. This is the only wall that was added. This is just a divider between the two rooms, but this whole log portion would have been one large workshop at the time. But we have it set up to show some of the different types of work that women and men did at home.
Okay.
During the winter months, women spent a large portion of their time spinning yarn. This is the linen cloth that was used for clothing and sheets and everything that they needed. They may have had some wool from sheep, but there was no cotton until the railroads started bringing that up later in the 1800s. So you were either linen or wool. And this is a walking wheel, so you would get your steps in for the Fitbit that day. They would use this to spin yarn. And then the girls had some jobs as well. This is a clock wheel that they used to wind and measure yarn. So you can see all of these are evenly spaced. And they would sing songs like Pop Goes the Weasel while they sing it. And then when the weasel popped, they would know they had a skein of yarn and could take it off and take that to the weaver. This is a small loom called a tape loom, and we've seen these throughout the house. They use them, with the baby. They would also use them as belts to hold up their clothing. But this is a job that even 5 or 6-year-old children will learn how to do, and then they would be, really contributing and helping their family with something useful. We can switch to this side of the room.
Sorry,
these are some jobs that men would have had. This is a schnitzel bunk or a chipping bench, and you would sit across, straddle it, put whatever you're working on, leather or wood in here, and then you could work at shaping it. Another thing I think is interesting about the tools is there are no two items that are alike. Now if you want a hammer, you get it on Amazon or Walmart or whatever, and they're all the same. But each individual one was made with an individual person in mind. So you can see they're all different shapes and sizes. So I think that's kind of fun.
Oh yeah, it is.
This large saw in the back corner, that was used for ice, because prior to refrigeration, they would need to cut these large boxes of ice or blocks of ice and store them in sawdust so they could keep their food cold. If you're able to get a close-up of this map, this gives a really good view of what liddits looked like, the time period we're talking about. So this was made to show what it was like in 1800. And so you can see how all of these houses along this side of Main Street back up to the creek. And in 1800, there were 36 dwellings and there were 100 adults. So it was a very small community. You can imagine everybody knew everybody else. And we're going to be seeing how Mr. Mueller dyed the cloth that they used. This is an instruction book that was recorded after he died by one of the people who knew all of his methods and recipes. He could actually make 26 different colors using all natural ingredients that he got, just out in the backyard. So for example, this one says dyeing the scarlet, and it gives step-by-step instructions of, if you wanted to make a red color, how you would do that. So we can go through and I'll show you the workshop. I'm gonna start over here by this wheelbarrow full of flax. So flax is the plant that they use to make the linen cloth. And it is a very long process. It's about 100 days from the time you plant the seed until harvest. And so they would go out in about July and cut it down by hand, and then they would let it lay in the field for about 5 or 6 weeks and start to dry and rot. At that point, you could bring your wheelbarrow full of flax and bring it to the break. And this works by, this comes up, you lay your flax in here, and you just start crushing it to break apart that hard outer shell from the fiber. Because if I can show you, Tim.
Yep, here, I'll just get out of the way.
This soft part inside, and you can feel it if you want, that's what they would use to spin into the yarn, and this outer shell part comes off. So they would take a couple steps. This is a scutching board, and you would work this up and down to further break it apart. And then the last step is a heckle, It kind of looks like a medieval torture device, but it's actually just like a giant comb, and you would keep working that through until you get it to this point, and it actually feels just like human hair.
Oh my gosh, it does. You should feel this.
Yeah, so this is what they would work with to make their yarn.
It's so creepy. It's so creepy.
You can't do a touch of vision on the.
I know. It's so creepy.
So Mr. Mueller's job then was to dye and make different colors. So some of the more popular colors you can see in my outfit, these shades right here, he would have been able to make. And so people would come through that door and bring him what they wanted to dye. He would have the apprentices do a lot of the jobs, going out to get firewood, filling up this giant kettle with water and getting a big, boiling kettle of water going. And then depending what color they wanted to make, he would send them out to gather things like certain roots, barks, seeds, leaves, berries, whatever he needed to make that color. You would grind it up with your mortar and pestle and then soak it in there. And then he had a rack out front where then he could dry it to hang them to dry. So for the first about 40 years, this was the community workshop of the dyer. In about 1830, Mr. Mueller was getting very old. His daughter Susanna and her husband Frederick moved in with her parents. And Frederick Zitzman was a pretty well-known man in town. Prior to living here, he actually ran the Lidditz Hotel on the square when he was first married to Susanna. And then they moved here, and in 1830, he was appointed the postmaster. So from 1830 to 1849, this became the Lidditz Post Office.
Oh, wow.
And I'll show you over here. We just got this back. I think it's been 2 years ago now. This is the original cabinet that he would have used to sort the mail. This ended up through either inheritance or auctions in Colorado, and there was a gentleman who contacted us and said, would you like to have this back in the room where it originally was? And we said, sure, that would be wonderful. So we now have this postmaster's case, and the mail worked a lot differently than it does now. You get mail delivered to your house. Back then, you had to go to the post office and pick it up. So everyone in the community would come through that door. This was really, a hub of the town. And how you would know that you had mail waiting for you is they would publish little notes in the newspaper like this with just a list of names of people who have letters waiting for them. And when you came to pick it up, you had to pay. So instead of, now it's the opposite, the person who's sending the mail pays with the stamp. You had to pay to pick up your mail. And they charged by distance, which actually makes sense when you think about, how they were transporting it. But this is a comparison of what it would cost in 1830 to 2019, which is about the same now. And so depending how far you went, that's how much you would pay to send a letter, which was one sheet of paper. So they would be very careful to, fill every inch of that paper that they could to keep it down to one sheet of paper.
Wow.
And here's some examples of stamps they had in that time period, Ben Franklin and George Washington.
Nice.
So in addition to being the postmaster, Frederick Zitzman was also the treasurer of the Lidditz Fire Company. And we have in the corner an example of an early fire engine. And this partially explains why they were so afraid of fire, because this is the best they had to fight it with. So when a fire broke out, they first had to get this thing pulled down to where the fire was. You would hook a hose here, and the other end you would put down into your cistern or a creek if you lived nearby. You would turn this to force the water through, and that was about it. So this was the firefighting apparatus they had at the time. Trying to think if there's anything else to show you. There's a couple more items behind you that are examples of rakes and shovels. Again, they're all, individually made for one person. And the one with the blade on the bottom is a snow shovel.